So if you would, please join me in providing a warm ESU welcome to Jack.
I have been excited about coming to visit with you for some time. I've known that I was coming to Kansas for months, and I've had difficulty explaining to my friends and colleagues why I was so excited about coming to visit with you. I mean, it was hard for me to explain why a guy from Los Angeles, who has practiced in San Francisco and Chicago and New York and went to college in New York and now practices in Washington, D.C., was excited about going to Emporia, Kansas. But perhaps I can explain it to you by emphasizing how exciting it is to discuss the underpinnings of our most fundamental rights of free speech and free expression, our core consciousness. You see, during a time like the time that we live in now, an election cycle with so many crucial issues before the electorate, in a country with citizenry that is impassioned, our freedom of speech must reign supreme. Political topics are always hot topics, and in institutions of higher learning, the objective in this environment must be the free flow and exchange of ideas for the purpose of broad learning and intellectual challenge. Now, there is an argument that has been ongoing between me and my father for the better part of 30 years. My father was born and raised in Louisiana. He was born and raised in the segregated South. Those roots inform his tolerance of what he is inclined to hear expressed. Now, in case anybody didn't notice, I'm African American. So is my father, Creole to be exact. And he grew up around people who weren't afraid to call him boy, or worse, much worse. And so his sensitivities are different. And it's a matter of fact that today some people continue to maintain bigoted tendencies. So the argument between the two of us is this: would you rather have a bigot be kind to you, to your face, and behind your back exhibit what is his or her consciousness? Or would you have that bigot look you in the eye and call you a nigger to your face? Now, I have experienced both. But my preference is the latter. Now understand, my father, having grown up in the segregated South, he says, son, you don't know what that feels like. My experience is different. My position is, I want the bigot to express him or herself. Then I know his conscience. I know where he's coming from. We have an understanding. I may be able to persuade him of the error of his ways. I may not. But at least our consciousness is at the forefront and we can work forward from there. Now, wherever you might fall in that argument, I want you to think of the notion of consciousness. Think of where I'm coming from when I say I prefer that the individual be able to express his or her consciousness because that's going to be the topic of our discussion today. Freedom of speech in the context of our democracy, but thinking particularly about consciousness. Now, as we talk today, I want you to bear in mind some theoretical underpinnings of this notion of consciousness. Early at the inception of our country, there were notions of freedoms that were in the thoughts and minds of the framers of our Constitution. Those thoughts came in large part from two individuals with divergent views. Their names are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. I want you to take just a few minutes and think with me about where those views came from. I say that the two had divergent views, but they were complementary. Hobbes employed a very mechanistic concept of freedom, defining freedom as the absence of physical impediments, whereas Locke employed a social concept, defining freedom as the absence of coercion in human affairs. The two also had divergent views on consciousness. Thomas Hobbes laid the foundation, and the foundation that he laid was also a foundation for the liberal view of politics. His concept of the state of nature grounds politics in the individual's desire to preserve his life and his goods, and it stipulates that the role of government is to serve those ends. Happiness or felicity is continual success in obtaining what we desire. For Hobbes, the individual has no natural duties toward others or to the common good. Obligations are taken up only as necessary means to one's own end. Furthermore, Hobbes makes clear that the individual retains his natural right to preserve himself even after, as a member of society, he has no obligation to submit himself, even as a member of society, he has no core obligation to the society that he's a part of. In other words, that member of society has no obligation to submit himself to capital punishment, or if he lived today, that individual would have no obligation to submit himself to, like, the military draft. Hobbes' political ideas raised a lot of controversy in his time. They continue to be a little bit contentious because a lot of people disagree with Hobbes' position that politics should be viewed primarily as an instrument to serve self-interest. And they side with Aristotle, who divergently believed that politics serves both basic needs and higher ends. The most important thing to know about Thomas Hobbes is he believed that consciousness was shared knowledge. Now, let me try to explain what he meant by that. Hobbes believed that everybody has notions inside them, but those notions alone mean nothing until they are shared. And that process of sharing, that social interconnectivity, shared consciousness, is what freedom really is. Without the shared consciousness, there is no freedom. Then there was John Locke. Not long after Thomas Hobbes' death, Locke used many of the elements of Hobbes' thought to develop the first full account of modern political liberalism. For Locke, consciousness was social identity. Consciousness can be transferred under Locke from one individual to another, from one substance to another. And thus, while the soul of the individual is changed, consciousness remains the same, thereby preserving the personal identity throughout the change. The point is, the only way that consciousness can be materialized is through interpersonal connectivity. That's the tie between the two of them. Freedom comes from consciousness, and consciousness cannot exist without interpersonal connectivity. That's the thread. Now, both of them also believe in the equality of consciousness. And you see the theoretical underpinnings of both principles if you listen to some of our founding documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's Locke and Hobbes, saying that all of us are equal and that we have certain rights that are inalienable, but those rights can only be expressed in community through consciousness. Now, if you will agree with me, just for the sake of argument, that consciousness is significant for the purpose of the development of a free society, then you must also agree that consciousness requires interconnectivity among people. And if there must be that interconnectivity, then there must be free speech. That's where we get to free speech. We get to free speech from an embracing of the notions that underlie freedom and a conceptual and philosophical embrace of the notion of consciousness. But there are real and potential harms and risks to holding freedoms of speech and expression sacrosanct. These freedoms must be an indispensable condition of all other freedoms. They deserve a place in our common system of government. Why is that? Well, the history of free speech is laden with many reasons, but there are some pillars that undergird the importance of free speech in our society. One is that freedom of speech is essential to freedom of thought. The second is that freedom of speech is essential to democratic self-government. And the third is that the alternative, which is government censorship and control of ideas, has invariably, inevitably led to societal destruction. Let's talk for a moment about freedom of speech. Freedom of thought. I mentioned that freedom of speech is essential to freedom of thought because a person can't develop an independent point of view about the world unless he or she is exposed to different ideas about what is important and what beliefs are most meaningful. That person must be permitted to converse with others about their own individual experiences or beliefs. Just as totalitarian societies are premised upon complete control over people's actions and beliefs, free societies are premised on freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. The right to have beliefs without risking punishment or thought crime. Thought crime being the holding of unapproved beliefs and ideas as violating societal norms. This freedom can develop only in a society that protects a broad and diverse range of opinions. This protection is necessary not for those whose beliefs and actions are consistent with dominant opinion. Bear in mind, people seldom try to oppress what is acceptable and popular. It exists for those who insist on asserting their individuality against dominant opinion. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "If there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attack than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate." In this sense, free speech and freedom of thought are essential components of any truly diverse society. Without them, the pressure for conformity overwhelms potential growth and development and expansion of individual ideas. Moreover, there's little value in allowing people to develop their own conscience, their own commitments, and their own identities if the society that criminalizes the ability to express them to others exists. So why come up with a new idea, a new expression of consciousness, if you know that the environment that you live in is going to suppress those novel ideas? To hide who one is and what one believes, for fear that the mere act of expressing oneself risks punishment, is an exceedingly cruel and oppressive circumstance. The rights of conscience and free speech are designed to prevent such torment. This is why freedom of thought is so important as a connection to our free consciousness. It's the beginning of a free society. However, it goes further. Democratic self-government requires an appreciation of consciousness. Democracy presupposes that the people, the governed, may freely receive information and opinion on matters of public interest and the actions of government officials. The act of voting still occurs in many autocratic societies where speech is severely limited and government officials punish people who criticize the government. A lot of dictators brag about receiving over 90% of the vote, not realizing that such numbers cast doubt on their own validity. It's not the act of voting that creates a self-governing society, but rather the people's ability to formulate and communicate their opinion about what decisions or policies will best advance the community's welfare. The right to be informed about matters of public is considered so fundamental to democracy that Benjamin Franklin called it the principal pillar of a free government. And Thomas Jefferson stated, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Another way of saying what Franklin and Jefferson were communicating is that the freedom of expression is the major bulwark against tyranny in a political system. All successful autocrats start by punishing dissenters, criminalizing speech that might threaten their power, and dominating those institutions that would otherwise be dedicated to incubating independent thought, including newspapers, and especially universities. A citizenry that is not free to share its common experience and hear dissenting views is hard-pressed to challenge those who oppress and immiserate them. In free societies, meanwhile, rights of free expression allow a diverse political community to work through its different views without always succumbing to violence. Political systems are more stable when individuals feel as if they have had a fair chance to have their say. And even if they lose in the short run, will have more opportunities to convince their fellow citizens of the wisdom of their views. Now, you can agree with me that freedom of speech is important for the purpose of freedom of thought. And you can agree with me that freedom of speech is important in a democratic society. But I want to talk about the consequences of censorship. There are a couple of lawyers in the room, and in law we call it prior restraint. Censorship is stopping someone from saying something before they actually get a chance to say it. And history shows us that this alternative to freedom of speech, government censorship, and control of ideas is disastrous for a society. These methods have indeed been used throughout history to prevent challenges to people in power, to secure the place of dominant social groups against people who are considered less worthy of respect. They've also been used to prevent the circulation of new ideas that threaten the status quo. If one does not know the history of the struggle for free speech, then one might think that restrictions on speech can be a force for protecting the vulnerable. But history tells us the exact opposite. Censorship has always been on the side of the authoritarian. It's been on the side of authoritarianism, conformity, ignorance, and the status quo. And the advocates of free speech have always been on the side of making societies more democratic, more diverse, more tolerant, more educated, and more open to progress. This helps us understand why the protection of free speech has been so rare in human history and is still rare today. Support for free speech is synonymous with a genuine commitment to democracy, diversity, and change. Authoritarians find themselves inexorably willing to sacrifice liberty and democracy on the altar of social order and conformity. Every once in a while you put together a sentence that you really like. People who argue against free speech will sacrifice new ideas and innovation and progress on the altar of conformity and social peace. Free speech can be violent on people's ideas, and people who argue against free speech frequently say, we just want peace. Have those people with those new ideas just shut up. But it doesn't work it does not inure to the benefit of the progress and development of a free society. What it does do is it slowly and tenuously breaks down a society. Free speech, however, thrives when members of a society agree that individuals should be free to make their own choice about what to hear and what to believe and how to behave. It thrives when people agree that they should be able to challenge leaders and advocate for social change. It is valued when people are open to new ideas about how the world works, how society should be organized, and what values are most important. The history of free speech in America illustrates these points and provides an essential backdrop to present debates over free speech. However, I'm about to be a hypocrite with you. For the past 20 minutes, time flies, because I have about 2 more hours of material for you. For the past 20 minutes, I've been sharing with you how important it is as a core value. Look, let me state this differently because I'm seeing it in a life way right now. I have a daughter. She is my daughter. She's 12 years old. She's good in school. She's in the advanced programs and all that stuff. She's pretty. I hate that she moved from cute to pretty, but she did. That's great. She dances, and she's skilled at dancing. That's not what I'm most proud of. What I am most proud of is that she can express herself. Alexis, you can't wear those shorts. But Daddy, let's talk about that. It ticks me off in the moment. But that is what I want. Okay? Now I'm pausing to tell you this for a reason. America, if you look at the life of America, we're a young country. We are a very young country. 1776 was just a minute ago. And the inception of our Constitution in the 1780s is just a minute ago. If you look at our country on the long timeline of life, we are in our adolescence. So I look at my daughter and I marvel at how she is able to express herself. I look at my country the same way. The only way that our country is going to thrive and endure and grow and fight and fuss over tough issues is if we embrace consciousness. That's the reason for the argument between me and my father. My father says, don't say the word nigger. I say, I know the history of this country, and if you don't say the word nigger, then it's inside your consciousness, and you're holding it. Say it, express it. Let's fight about it. Not fight, but let's argue about it, because I'll win. Let's argue about it. Let's fuss about it, but let's deal with it. That is consciousness. Okay? We have to turn the corner because the existence of these freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness, it's not absolute. In the landmark case of West Virginia versus Barnett in 1943, the Supreme Court emphasized that the mere freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order, close quote. Stated differently, a society that embraces free speech is not one that invites social Tourette syndrome. It's a society that has at least some proscriptions against harmful and damaging speech. Throughout American history, powerful arguments have been advocated for restricting speech that is considered harmful. And we've learned the advantages of extending free speech protection even in the face of legitimate concerns about harm. How do general free speech principles and the current state of the First Amendment apply to variations of harmful speech, harmful expression, what some would call hate speech? I want us to keep our thoughts, as I go through some of this, what's called hate speech, I want us to keep our thoughts focused on the context of higher education. Although the Supreme Court has never ruled on whether colleges and universities can prohibit altogether expressions of hate, the court's decisions have touched on a variety of issues that are related to potentially harmful expression in 4 areas. One area is group libel. Let me tell you, because I see at least 2 people taking notes. Let me tell you what those 4 areas are. There are 4 areas where the Supreme Court, you know what, it occurs to me I should back up a second. When we think about what First Amendment law is, there are not a set of statutes that dictate what First Amendment law is. It's an entire area of jurisprudence that is written and defined by the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court has parsed out specific areas of harmful or hateful speech that it has decided to make decisions on and write law on so that we know the parameters of harmful or hate speech. Those areas are group libel, fighting words, which we're going to talk about, laws prohibiting cross-burning. Now, I call it cross-burning. We'll call it together cross-burning, but it's really overt acts that have symbolic meaning. Okay. And the 4th is statutes that impose greater penalties for hate-motivated crime. Right? More than a half century ago, the Supreme Court held that group libel is not protected by the First Amendment. The case is called Bearnaise versus Illinois. The court upheld a state law that prohibited any publication portraying, quote, depravity, criminality, unchastity, or lack of virtue of a class of citizens of any race, color, creed, or religion, which exposes such citizens to contempt, derision, or obloquy, or which is productive of breach of the peace or rights. Now, Justice Frankfurter, who was a justice on the court, affirmed the conviction of a set of individuals who had urged the mayor and city council to protect white neighborhoods from, quote, encroachment, harassment, and invasion by the Negro, and who called for 1 million self-respecting white people in Chicago to unite. Now, just as a state can punish defamation against an individual, wrote Frankfurter, so may it punish the same utterance directed at a defined group. Noting the strife caused by expressions of hate based on race and religion, he concluded that the government did not need to show that these expressions pose a clear and present danger, because libelous utterances, not being within the area of constitutionally protected speech, it's unnecessary either for us or for the state courts to consider the issues behind the phrase clear and present danger. Now, later this case that said it was okay to have a statute that disallowed writing hate speech. That was later overturned. The speech at issue in Bearnaise, however vile, was political speech. And it's highly doubtful that the court today would allow punishment of individuals for expressing opinions about racial groups or calling for government actions. In fact, a later decision strongly indicated that expression of hate is not entirely outside First Amendment protection. In a separate context, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional a law prohibiting burning a cross or painting a swastika in a manner likely to cause alarm, anger, or resentment. A reflection of the abandonment of Bearnaise is found in a case called National Socialists of America versus Skokie. I'm running out of time, so I have to tell you this case a little fast. Skokie, Illinois, a group of neo-Nazis wanted to have a demonstration. They tried to apply for a permit to be able to have the demonstration. They chose Skokie, Illinois because a large population in the city of Skokie, Illinois was actually of Jewish descent. And these neo-Nazis wanted to have greater effect with their demonstration. They applied for a permit, and what the city in Skokie, Illinois said to them was, you can have the permit, but you got to put up, it was well over $250,000 in bond in order to have the permit. They appealed that all the way to the Illinois State Supreme Court, and the Illinois State Supreme Court encumbered them in a whole bunch of administrative junk. The Supreme Court said, no, if they want to protest, you have to let them protest. And I'm standing in front of you today. I have to remind you that because I did say it, but some of you look a little sleepy. I'm African American. I'm standing here in front of you today to tell you that Skokie is a good decision, because what the Supreme Court said is if those neo-Nazis want to abide by the laws that you have put in place to have a peaceable demonstration, just because you think there might be some discord on the other end, you can't stop them from demonstrating. The reasons why the city of Skokie said that they didn't want the demonstrations was because they said it's the same as group libel. They are saying bad things about Jewish people. You got to appreciate this was happening in 1970, and so a lot of Holocaust survivors were still living, and they were in the city of Skokie, Illinois, and that's why it was so inflammatory that this was going on. But this is America, and we don't get to the other side of those types of bigoted tendencies until and unless we let the neo-Nazis protest in Skokie, Illinois. Now, there are difficulties with letting things like that happen because it offends sensitivities. However, the Skokie controversy reflects a lot of basic First Amendment principles. The courts ruled that expression of hate is protected speech. The courts ruled that the government may not outlaw symbols of hate, such as swastikas. Moreover, the government cannot suppress a speaker because of an anticipated audience reaction, the anticipation that there might be discord as a result of what the neo-Nazis were doing. Skokie was not allowed to prevent the Nazis from marching even though their demonstration would deeply offend and upset the Holocaust survivors and might even provoke a violent response. For our context, the Skokie litigation and other developments in First Amendment law since Bearnaise make it very difficult to argue that campuses can prohibit hate speech. Now, another type of speech that the courts have dealt with is fighting words. In the 1942 case called Shaplinski versus New Hampshire, the Supreme Court expressly held that fighting words are unprotected by the First Amendment. Shaplinski was a Jehovah's Witness. He was distributing literature for his religion on a street corner on a Saturday afternoon and gave a speech denouncing other religions as a racket. I'm quoting from the case now, okay. He said at one point to a listener, "You are a goddamn racketeer and a damn fascist, and the whole government of Rochester are fascists or agents of fascists," close quote. The Supreme Court upheld Shaplinski's conviction for this speech, saying, "Allowing the broadest scope to the language and purpose of the 14th Amendment, it is well understood that the right of free speech is not absolute at all times and under all circumstances. There are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem." Listen to this language. "These include the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and the insulting or fighting words, those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace." The court said that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. Resort to epithets or personal abuse is not, in any proper sense, communication of information or opinion safeguarded by the Constitution. All right. Shaplinski looks like it recognizes two situations where speech constitutes fighting words. Number one, when speech is likely to cause a violent response against the speaker. And number two, when it's an insult likely to inflict immediate emotional harm. There is so much that I want to tell you about this. Fighting words. But I gotta get to the bottom line. Since Shaplinski, no conviction for violating a statute, a fighting word statute, has been upheld. Let me say that differently. Shaplinski is good law, so that definition of fighting words, stuff that is likely to inflict, is immediately offensive on its face or likely to cause some kind of bad thing, that's still good law. But every time a case has come to the Supreme Court of a conviction of someone for fighting words, it's been overturned. Why? Because you can do that. And the reason is, any way that you write a statute like that, it's going to be either vague or overbroad. And what that means is, a law that punishes fighting words in general will be too broad as vague, which means it covers too much. Because there could be things that you could say that would not constitute fighting words, but the statute as written includes it as fighting words, and so the Supreme Court strikes down the statute. or a narrower law focusing just on certain types of fighting words will be struck down as too narrow and content-based. So it has to be so narrow that it determines a specific subject that you cannot talk about and incite somebody else to fight. But if you're just talking about a specific subject, then you're being content-based and you're discriminating against other subjects, and so the law is stricken down as unconstitutional. So, what does that mean for our context here? While the fighting words exceptions technically still exist, a fighting words conviction in all the years since that decision called Shaplinsky has never been upheld. And what that means is it's very difficult in this context, the context of higher education, to stop that kind of speech. Now, let's talk about cross-burning. In Virginia versus Black, which is a much more recent decision, the court held that governments may prohibit cross-burning when it's intended to intimidate, but this intent must be proven in that particular case. How do I make this one concise? Okay, Virginia versus Black was one case that went to the Supreme Court, but it actually had two cases. So sometimes the Supreme Court has 10,000 petitions come to the court every year. And of that 10,000, less than 100 get decided. So when they have two cases that are extremely similar, they decide them together. They had a statute in Virginia that had two instances of cross-burning. Two different people challenged the statute that was a Virginia statute. And the court took both cases. One of the cases had a group of people go out into a field, and it was a private field, nobody was around, they burned a cross, people heard about it and sued, saying that their burning of the cross violated the statute against cross-burning. The other group of people, somebody burned a cross in front of somebody's house, okay, on somebody's personal property. So the Supreme Court took both of those cases and decided them together. And here's where they came down. First, the government cannot prohibit all cross-burning. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the majority, explained that burning a cross is symbolic expression, and the government can't ban symbols just because they are powerful and offensive. Second, cross-burning as a means of communicating a serious intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals, what is known in the law as a true threat, is not protected by the First Amendment. And third, there must be proof in the individual case that the speech was a true threat. Okay, so what do we take away from that? Cross-burning is what I'm using as an example, but it can be any other type of symbolic speech. And what the court has said is you can't just say that any type of symbolic speech is unconstitutional just because it's offensive. You've got to let people express themselves. Let me make the Supreme Court's argument. People have their consciousness. People have what's inside them, and you have to let them express themselves. Unless it's a true threat to somebody else's safety and security. So, in that case, the people who burned the cross out in the field on private property, nobody, no harm, no foul, good, go ahead. But the people who burned the cross in front of somebody's house, I mean, this case, I remember this one because Justice Thomas, who I got to know some while I was at the court, he doesn't talk much in court. But when they had the case where people were burning crosses on private property in Virginia, he lives in Virginia, in Virginia in front of somebody's house. His house is in Virginia. He lives about 4 miles from where me and my wife live. He spoke up in court. And this doctrine of true threat was born. Now, the last of these 4 areas, these 4 carve-out areas that I want to talk about, is penalty enhancements for hate-motivated crimes. The court has considered hate speech in this context, and the context is laws that provide enhanced penalties for these hate-motivated crimes. In Wisconsin versus Mitchell, that's the name of the case, it was in 1993, the court upheld a state law that imposed greater punishments if it could be proved that a victim was chosen as a direct result of his or her race. And the Supreme Court emphasized that these penalty enhancements are directed at conduct, not at speech, and that they are justified because biased motivated crimes are more likely to provoke retaliatory crimes and inflict distinct emotional harms on their victims and incite community unrest. The state's desire to redress these perceived harms provides an adequate explanation for its penalty enhancement provisions over and above mere disagreement with offenders' beliefs or biases. This logic is similar to that in the context of employment discrimination cases, because in those cases the prohibition is based on bad conduct, but speech acts may be part of the proof that bad conduct took place. Now, we have those 4 areas, and I want, and I think some of you want too, I want us to have a little bit of time for Q&A. As long as you ask nice questions. Before we do that, I want you all to indulge me, because I have about 10 more pages of very valuable stuff to share with you that I'm not going to share, but in order to consolidate it, what those 10 pages were about is, should hate speech be addressed on campuses? And what do we do about hate speech on campus? It's rough. The University of Michigan tried real hard. In 1986, they had a group of students. It was a very errant year. And a lot of university administrators are required to study what happened at the University of Michigan as they get their degrees in university administration. But they had a group of students who were referring to black people as porch monkeys and jigaboos and the N-word and all kinds of stuff. So they came up with this statute that said, if you do any kind of stuff like that and make any kinds of references like that, then you are subject to penalties. Stanford University had the same thing. University of Wisconsin had the same thing. But let me tell you something. Every single university that has come up with policies like that, that restrict speech just to keep good order on campus, they've been struck down. Why? Because this is a different type of environment. Look, what happened was, at the University of Michigan, when they were trying to strike down those laws, they had an individual who was in the midst of doing a study on Jewish people, and in the midst of his study, he said that he believed that the Holocaust and the repercussions of the Holocaust was part of the reason why so many Jewish people had their feelings on policy toward Palestine. And he was punished under one of those campus statutes. Another grad student was doing a study on why black people were having difficulty performing in a certain specific genre, academic discipline. It was an academic study, and they got punished under one of these campus proscriptions on speech, when what they were doing was academic. This environment is extraordinarily unique. I said stuff here today that look, to be honest with you, I thought long and hard about some of the words that I said today, because I don't use those words in my ordinary vernacular, but this is an academic setting. Sometimes things get said and must necessarily get said for academic purposes. About 6 years ago, a university professor was doing a study. And in that study, he found empirically that African Americans were not capable of having the same IQ as Caucasian Americans. Incensed the academic community. People were ticked off. I am elated that he did that study, because people got so ticked off that they started unraveling his research, and they found out that he was using junk science and that his numbers were wrong. And they found out that some of what he was comparing was not apples to apples comparisons. It was, it was designed to look like the outcome that he wanted to create. And if he had not had the opportunity to express himself, to let his consciousness come to light, then we wouldn't get to the result of the academic conclusion that what he was saying was junk. This is a very different environment. This environment of academia requires, it needs, it invites the free flow exchange of ideas. Some ideas that are offensive to other people. But the idea that is offensive to you may very well be sacred and precious to someone else. And that is consciousness. So I want us to end where we began, because there is this danger that we have to avoid, especially in the context of academia. Because censorship of words leads to censorship of ideas. Although advocates for speech codes and speech codes on campus, they claim that hate speech plays no part in the legitimate expression of ideas, censorship of words leads inevitably to the censorship of ideas. It's tempting to say that campuses should, at the very least, be able to prohibit epithets, words like nigger and faggot. They cause great harm. But it is not difficult to imagine contexts in scholarly analysis like today, or popular culture, or casual conversation, where the use of any given word would be considered appropriate. As Justice Harlan of the Supreme Court eloquently explained, we cannot indulge the facile assumption that one can forbid particular words without also running a substantial risk of suppressing ideas in the process. Indeed, governments might soon seize upon the censorship of particular words as a convenient guise for banning the expression of unpopular views. Hate speech codes inescapably ban the expression of unpopular ideas and views, which should arguably never be tolerable in our country, in our society, but not in our colleges and universities. But even if colleges and universities can't and shouldn't try to ban hate speech, they still must act to create a conducive learning environment for all students. The question then becomes, what can they do? And the answer must necessarily involve respect for consciences and fidelity to the academic mission. And I'll shut up.